the Second World War, when a lot of people came together and said, we can never, ever let this happen again. And that's when you saw efforts to create the United Nations, when you saw the efforts that eventually led to the creation of the European Union. And we're seeing fractures in those institutions, yeah, and some of which have needed addressing for a long time as well. We've also seen a lot of the economic tensions that come from globalization. The good part about it is that many people who were extremely poor are moving up. There's much less hunger, there's much less extreme poverty. You've seen a growing middle class in other parts of the world from the United States. And that's all very good, and it's very good for the United States. But the problem is there's Branko Milanovic created a graph called the elephant curve,
Right.
which shows that the very poor and the very rich benefited the most from globalization. So you have this big group of people in the middle who are feeling very, very left behind. And particularly that's a lot of the middle and upper classes in the wealthiest countries in the world. And frankly, a lot of the poorer people in the United States, by a lot of measures, are still in the upper echelons of the global economy. And so many things about globalization have helped many people, but the lion's share of the gains from that have gone to the very small, the 1%, the 0.1% at the top lane. And they have been consolidating their wealth, a lot of it in secondary markets, in the stock market, in securities that are just traded as basically paper wealth. And that money is not recirculating through the economy. So you see these very, very dangerous consequences of rising economic inequality, where the people who are falling behind can't pay for basic necessities, much less improvements in their lifestyle, all the while they see this huge growth at the top. In fact, I saw a story somewhere that the wealth of the top, the very wealthiest, grew by 25% last year, which is crazy. So that that's caused problems for social and political systems, but it's also got serious implications for the sustainability of this economic model. That at some point, when you see these high share prices, which by a lot of measures are still high despite the huge fall that we just had, when earnings from those shares can't justify these huge prices that people are paying anymore, the stock markets are going to continue to fall as well. So we need to change this dynamic so that you're not just getting money that kind of sticks at the top, but that you're getting money that's circulating, that's trickling up from the bottom, circulating through the economy. I mean, that's how you keep companies doing well. It's when their customers can actually buy things. You think back to Henry Ford and his $5 day. Obviously a very controversial business figure in a lot of ways, but his basic point made a lot of sense. He says that we're not going to succeed if the people who work for us can't eventually buy our products. And that's a principle that often gets lost in the economy today. So it's a very difficult time for globalization, where you're seeing people pull back. But what should be happening is a much more surgical focus on the things that aren't working. The fact that that so many people can't get health care, that 40% of Americans have trouble meeting a $400 emergency expense when so many people have so much more than they need. And it's a big political problem, it's a big economic problem, and it needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, I completely agree. But one of the reason I want to ask this question again, because few of our joinees who joined late, they wanted to ask this question again, because I just got the message. They wanted to ask and know more about Gray Rhino. So I'm asking this question again. So since you are the author of Gray Rhino, and people who have joined later, I would like to give a little bit background about who Michele Wucker is. Michele Wucker got tired of hearing people insisting that they never saw it coming. When they saw it more often and they see the dangers, they do not sound the alarm. So she coined the term Gray Rhino to draw attention to the highly probable, high impact risk that everyone hates to admit, but they neglected. She introduced the concept at the World Economic Forum's 2013 annual meeting in Davos, then developed Gray Rhino theory into the influential international bestseller, The Gray Rhino: How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. When China's president mentioned gray rhinos last year, global markets tumbled. Business continuity, central bank, and military planners all use her framework, as do investors and C-suite decision makers. Michele is a former think tank and media executive who has been recognized as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum and a Guggenheim Fellow, among other honors. More than 2 million people have watched her recent TED Talk on why so many people ignore obvious challenges and how we can do better at acting instead of getting trampled. So your book came a few years ago. We had time to prepare for this. Now, coming back to the most important question is, why do you think coronavirus pandemic is not a black swan, it's a gray rhino?
Right. Well, I'll just very briefly touch on that, since some people have heard it. That pandemics have been warned about many times recently by people who know what they're doing. They happen over and over again. Similarly, financial fragilities. We've got a number of problems: high corporate debt, overpriced stock market, many other problems over the last year. But since we're kind of going back to Gray Rhino and Gray Rhino theory, I wanted to talk just a little bit more about how the bigger theory works, because the metaphor on the one hand is something, when people are saying, oh, it's a black swan, nobody saw it coming, I want them to say, not looking in hindsight, which is really the only time you can see a black swan, look ahead. What are the gray rhinos coming at us in the future? And there's gray rhinos tend to go through a certain cycle, and I've identified 5 stages that they go through, and each stage has different obstacles and different opportunities and different strategies to help people to move forward. So there are 5 stages. The first is denial, which is what it sounds like, a bit of an homage to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her work on grief, on death and dying. And denial can happen for some reasons, different reasons. Sometimes it's because of deep-seated human biases, which I go into in a lot more detail in the book, and I can elaborate on it a little bit, depending on what people are interested in. But sometimes there's something called manufactured denial, where people with sort of a sinister background in industrial organizational psychology and marketing and behavioral economics know that we are prone to look away from the things that we don't want to see, right. And they manipulate that. And so there's a great book called Merchants of Doubt that goes into this, how this played out in, say, the tobacco industry and in fossil fuels, dealing with climate change. Basically that industries and governments will stage the way they want you to think about a crisis. And we've seen some of that in the huge gap between Democrats and Republicans in how worried they are about the coronavirus. And right. Some of it is because they look at different media. And in fact, there's other work that shows within each political group, opinions vary depending on the media that they look at, because it's not always the same. So, when thinking about denial and how to deal with it, I think you need to ask yourself, who has an interest in recognizing this problem or not? And look at different media, look at different perspectives. Don't just accept what your friends think. Exactly. Really push yourself. So that's denial. The second stage is muddling, or kicking the can down the road, as they like to say in finance and policy. And that's when you recognize the problem, but you come up with 472 reasons why you're not going to deal with it, why you can't. Oh, we don't have the money. Oh, there's no political will. Oh, blah, 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 blah. Um, there are lots and lots of reasons why people don't deal with things. Some of it has to do with incentives.
Right.
Look at how bonuses are set up in markets. Quarterly reports. There's been a big movement in sort of sustainable finance. People about let's get rid of these quarterly earnings reports. And in political cycles as well. It's part of why you see very different responses in authoritarian governments and in democracies. The good thing about authoritarian governments is that they have to take a lot more responsibility if they don't deal with the problem, because they have the power to do something. So if they don't, it's not so easy to blame someone else. But there's really a sense of government agency and people's expectations and whether the governments meet that or not. So the third stage is diagnosing. And that's when you shift your mentality from, hemming and hawing and blah, 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 I can't do this, to what does it take to solve the problem? Who needs to do what to get this problem fixed? What resources do we need? And if we don't have them, what do we need to do to get them?
Right.
The diagnosing stage also involves, looking at some of the dynamics we talked about a little while ago. Is this a problem we can just solve? It's pretty straightforward. Or are there other problems that need to be dealt with first? Is there a problem in our decision-making structure, like a meta-rhino, a structural or systemic problem? Is this something that can be solved by itself, or is it part of a network of problems that are interrelated? For example, I often talk about a triad of problems, which include climate change,
Right.
Inequality, which, climate change affects people differently, and usually it affects the people who've contributed least to the problem more than it does the people who contributed the most. And the third point of the triangle is financial fragilities, which
Right.
we've also been talking about. And central banks over the past year and big investment firms have increasingly been coming out and saying, hey, climate risk is investment risk. Larry Fink of BlackRock came out and said that in his open letter in January, announced a change in their investment policy. Within the environmental, social, and governance world, there's some skepticism as to how much that talk is going to turn into the walk. But the fact that the talk is happening is an important first step. But so climate change could cause bigger financial fragilities, partly because insurance firms are undercapitalized,
Right.
considering the extent of potential damages. And so those three all interact together. You can't solve any one of them without solving the other ones. So, you look at the connections between one issue and another. It's like, if I solve this problem, can I solve something downstream, or do I have to look upstream to fix it? So that's the diagnosing process. It's really looking hard at the options, prioritizing things, looking at what you can do and what you can't, if there is a good solution or not. The fourth stage is panic. And I often illustrate this in speeches with the Edvard Munch painting of the Scream. The guy going, ah! And I gave a talk in Norway once, and they loved it. I guess since the Norwegian audience, they absolutely loved it. But so panic is the stage where everyone runs around in the middle of the street, says, somebody do something, anything, just do something. And
we just noticed that today with the live video.
Exactly. Help! Exactly.
Yeah, and it's coming from a technologist.
Yes. Well, you managed to deal with it much better than I would have, because the technology is my personal Gray Rhino. So panic is when you're much more likely to do something, but you're also much more likely to do the wrong thing. This happens again in economic policy with the boom and bust cycles. We've seen over the past couple of cycles that during the boom, when you should be paying down debt, socking something away for a rainy day, we've instead seen additional stimulus. which means that when it falls, it's going to be a much steeper fall. And then what happens is, as people are going down the second half of the curve, that's when austerity kicks in, and that actually accelerates the downward trend. And so people are doing exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time. The good thing about panic, and the thing that I try to get people to think about, is it creates a sense of urgency. And what I recommend people do is try to create a sense of urgency without this, frenetic panic stage. And also, if you spend enough time in the diagnosing stage, you've got a nice, beautiful blueprint for a plan that people will do something with. Unfortunately, we've seen so many times that governments don't do that.
Right.
There's a headline I saw in the last couple of days that National Security Council and others had scenario planning around pandemics, and here's what you should do. And of course, did it get looked at and followed? No. Similarly, in the Gray Rhino, I wrote about a scenario planning exercise just a couple months before Hurricane Pam, which similarly is the Category 3 hurricane, many similarities. They came up with recommendations. This is what we should do. And a lot of those were just ignored. So, it's not enough to get a good plan into people's hands at the panic stage, but it sure helps. And then the final stage is action, which is what it sounds like. And if you don't get to that stage, then you just get trampled, splat. Two things that are important to understand about the action stage. One is that it starts with the mavericks, with the early adopters, the people who saw the problem early on, were passionate about trying to find a solution and raise awareness. So you want to identify the people who act. You want to identify who has common interests, how you can create often strange bedfellows, but how do you bring together the actors and amplify their efforts? And how do you get other people to join this curve? There's a lot of research on influencers that shows a curve. I'll try to do this backwards since this way, but it starts at the bottom. Very few people are paying attention. It goes over and gradually it goes up. There's this curve, and then all of a sudden it shoots up. A little bit like some of these coronavirus infection curves, unfortunately.
Right.
But that's actually where going viral comes from. It's very similar dynamic about ideas going viral. And the other part about action is that you want to track it. You want to see what's working and what's not. Do you need to change your path a little bit or a lot? Sometimes people are more afraid of doing something and doing the wrong thing than they are of doing nothing. That's why we see so much doing nothing. It's like the classic trolley problem, which I'm sure some of your Kennedy School friends have heard about, which is it's a psychology experiment whereby people are presented with the option of they see a train or trolley coming, and it's going to hit 6 people, and they have an option of flipping a switch so that it only kills 1 person, and they find that's very, very hard to do. Interestingly, it changes a lot if it's just a gorilla they're going to kill. If it's something that's dehumanized, right, they're much more likely to flip the switch. But people are very reluctant to act in times of trouble, and it goes to deep-seated psychological problems. But sometimes even what seems like the wrong step will change the dynamic, and it'll make it easier to get to the right place. So those are the 5 stages.
No, that's great. One of the thing that I also wanted to ask you is that we are talking right now about economic stimulus. There are a lot of discussions. There's $2 trillion plus packages are coming, both to the businesses and individual families. But the harshest hit are the small business and the startups. How do you think we should distribute money into the very grassroots level of the economy, which are small businesses and startups? And what kind of mechanism should be applied by the policy leaders?
It's such a hard question because you're talking about so many people. You're talking about the scale of getting something out there.
Right.
And I think that we don't necessarily have the infrastructure. But one of the things I can say that is not the way to do it is going and buying corporate bonds and securities on in the secondary markets. It's a very indirect way of doing it. I would focus on a couple of things. One, creating a fund to restructure debt, particularly medical and student loans, which have been getting so much attention, but also some of the credit card debt that we've seen. Right now, we've got record low borrowing rates, but you've got record high credit card rates, which doesn't make sense. And the way a lot of lending is structured is that if you are seen as a higher credit risk, which means you need the money more, you pay higher rates. So I think because there's an infrastructure set up for people who have loans or credit cards or things like that, working with some of those companies, say buying that debt at a discount and getting the rates down, I think is very important. Medical debt and student loans, a lot of that is distressed. And in one of my former lives as a financial journalist, I wrote about the restructuring of all the defaulted debt from the 1980s from what were then called less developed countries, which are now called emerging markets. And a lot of that stuff, the original lenders sold it at a deep discount. And then some of it was trading on secondary markets, sometimes at pennies, literally pennies on the dollar, sometimes dimes on the dollar. But there was a huge market in buying that distressed debt. And it then went through restructurings through the Brady plan. And it was reissued as bonds, and people bought that. And as those countries recovered, people made a lot of money from that. And I think we can use a very similar approach to a lot of the consumer debt in the economy. And once you get that dealt with, for many, many families, you can reverse this vicious downward cycle and turn it around. And the biggest thing the economy as a whole needs is for people to be able to spend money. Now, what better way to help people spend money than to get this debt albatross off of their back, partly or as a whole? So that's one part of it. Deal with that, try to really take some of the burden off of the people who are struggling in the economy. That's going to provide a way to buy products. Then the other part of it is some sort of support fund for small and medium enterprises, for growing businesses. Some of that might include some sort of an equity component. And in fact, we've been seeing with some of the debt proposals an equity component to that. New sorts of mortgages whereby the lender and the borrower share both the ups and the downs. So thinking about a system in which a big economic downturn automatically provides a little bit of a cushion, which actually makes a lot of sense for lenders. I mean, right now the system is set up so that when things get tough, it accelerates the number of defaults and the financial stresses. So we need to turn that around. So much easier lending facilities, access to capital, easier regulatory treatment for small and medium enterprises, coupled with a real serious effort to break up this debt problem. The bigger corporations also have record debt and have been having trouble meeting their obligations out of free cash flow. But once you're at that big corporate level, another company can swoop in and buy it. And we've already been getting money to those types of companies. Right. So it's much harder on the broader individual level, but there are things that we can do, particularly using some of the systems that are already in place.
Yeah, I think this was these are some of the amazing terms that you use, because right now I just did a SheVC actual interview with an AI fund partner, and there are a lot of questions about whether the startups that gets funding from the VCs, are they going to get any money from the government, because they are also the ones who are suffering. So there are a lot of misconceptions. There are a lot of things that are going on around, which is I think very, very dangerous, but at the same time putting people at a very vulnerable situation. And then there are women founders, who are not getting funding on top of this. And we saw the last year, the female founders got 2.79% of VC money. And you being one of the strongest voices when it comes to women economic policy, what are the systematic biases and prejudices that plays in effect in the venture capital community?
Sure, that's such a good question and so important. And I'm like, when you first reached out to me and we talked, I was just so excited about your work trying to
Thank you.
to address some of these issues. So really glad that we've got time to talk about that. So my new book is, which hopefully will come out about a year from now in the US and this fall in China, has to do with how we make risk decisions as individuals. Gray Rhino is much more about some of the bigger systemic issues, corporate and policy, and the new one is very much about psychology, biases, stereotypes. And there are a lot of stereotypes about women and risk taking. And there have been some studies that have come out asking VCs about what they thought about how risky, how likely women were to take risks, and good risks, not just the bad risks.
Right.
And they tended to think that women were much more risk averse than men, and the numbers didn't bear that out at all. There's some that looked at very, very hard financial indicators. They also looked at whether women-owned startups were likely to stay in business and succeed or not. Much better record for women than for male-owned businesses, and that goes to boards and decision-making in the organization as well. As you know, in tech, a lot of the boards are very, very short on women. And that needs to change. There are studies showing that diverse groups make better decisions on risk and other things.
Right.
I'm actually starting a bit of a campaign against this term risk averse, because you're either risk seeking or risk averse, but there's no judgment about good risks, opportunity risks, or dangerous risks. And there is some evidence that women make risk decisions differently from men, that they tend to be much more risk aware and
right.
risk savvy, which means that they're actually making decisions based on evidence and a thinking process instead of just making decisions, particularly under stress. Therese Houston has got a book called How Women Decide, which I cannot recommend strongly enough. And she talks about some research whereby they'd ask men and women to stick their hands into a bucket of cold ice. And that's something that stresses your system. And she found that when that happened, when men were presented with a series of risk decisions, the same as women, the men would make much riskier decisions and bad risky decisions, things where they would lose the bets because they were being too aggressive. Then in hindsight, they asked both the women and the men to judge how good a job that they did. And the women were much more accurate in assessing their performance than the men. So they're very, very different processes, but there's a lot to say that, when women have the same amount of information as men, they do make very similar decisions, unless it's a stress situation. And in a stress situation, women are actually much more likely to make better decisions. So for VC, that means that, a way too small portion of the pot is going to some of the founders with the greatest likelihood of success. That needs to change. You've seen a bunch of individuals, bunch of other efforts to help try to change that situation, but obviously there's a long way to go. And if you want to look at the bright side, when you start from a low base, you can, your upward trajectory can be much faster than
Right.
if you're starting from a, from a higher point. So I guess that's a weird way of finding some optimism in the situation.
One
But
of the,
it's,
yeah, one of the
go ahead.
questions, sorry, you were saying something, and did I cut you in the middle?
No, good. No, go ahead. Happy to, because I'm just looking
Um,
at the clock, so I want to make
yeah.
sure that we get all your questions in.
So one of the question that was asked actually by a female founder, her name is Katie Z, and she has asked, how do you get buy-in from policymakers across from both the sides of the aisle?
Well, that's two really different
And that's for the economic
both.
stimulus.
Oh, and then economic stimulus. Well, doing anything across the aisle these days is is harder and harder. So I'll just kind of stick with the how do you get buy-in. That really has to do with how active constituents are, and sadly, how generous donors are and what donors say they want. Um, and as far as constituents, there is also an element of how do you amplify your voice? And we've got social media now in a way that we didn't, which has been sort of a double-edged sword, in that it's given a lot of people a voice and a feeling that they have a say that they didn't before. Unfortunately, that has amplified the loudest voices and the people who know how to use bots most effectively. But there have been social media campaigns that hashtags and strategic partnership with groups of constituents that can get through to their elected officials. Getting people to actually reach out, to call, to email, to pop in. I've been involved with some groups that organize groups of influencers from different parts of countries and match them up with their elected officials. But I think really making the case as to why a certain decision will help someone's constituents, and then working with the nonprofits, with the civic groups, with the people who've got groups of people together who can say, hey, this will help a lot of us. Like, strength in numbers is a very, very important thing.
Right.
And the bipartisan thing is so hard. I have a good friend here in Chicago, Jonathan Perman, who's working with the Bipartisan Policy Center, who's got a program called American Congressional Exchange, where he gets someone from a red state and someone from a blue state and organizes visits to each other's states, and looking at the economy, talking to the constituents, getting a sense of that. And I'm just so inspired. He comes back from one of these trips with all these great stories about people getting together. I think some of it's going to have to do with political organizing around actually supporting people who work across the aisle. You've got a primary system right now where the extremes of either party have disproportionate influence because their people are the ones who are going to show up at the primary. And they're the ones who are likely to get more funding. So find ways of identifying the candidates who can work constructively across the aisle and amplifying them, amplifying the sane voices, the ones who are the America I used to think we lived in.
Exactly.
So it's going to involve some real political organizing, and well, I guess people can't canvass right now since they can't go door to door. But finding ways of getting people involved politically, and using social media, using networks. And my friend Genevieve Tiers, also in Chicago, has a great program called Run, the series, which has been produced, and they're working on getting up on a network now, but that works with women candidates. It gives them some of the skills they need: the fundraising, the social media, the personal branding, to help them get into office. And I saw the pilot of it several weeks ago and was so impressed. More initiatives like that around the country, and particularly the more women you get in office, the more attention you're going to get to some of the issues that women care about.
Right, right. Since we are running out of time, and there are a lot of questions that are coming right now, is all related to how to deal with this individually. People who are stuck at home with children, with no daycare, with no help around, you and your husband or your entire family is now all stuck in a smaller apartment or houses. What are your like top two or top three things that you deal with this, and personally, how do you manage this?
Well, I'm very lucky in that the only person who shares my apartment with me has 4 legs. She's asleep on the bed over there. She often likes to come in when I'm talking on the computer. She's worried about the scary voices in the computer. So it's so hard because people stepping up. People can't step up to help to have your kids over because of social distancing thing right now. A lot of people are using this as a time to step back and think strategically about their next steps, hoping that they
Right.
have enough space where kids aren't screaming all the time. In which case, if they've got a partner, then the partner needs to step up with helping keep the kids from from screaming at you all the time. One of the things that I've seen that I think helps a lot is thinking about what you can do to help others. So it helps you get out of your, woe is me, dealing with my own problems sort of situation. Thinking about that also gives you a sense of power. And this sense of power and human agency is so important, combating this sense of helplessness. One of the reasons why people don't deal with the obvious problems coming at them is that they don't feel like they've got the power to do anything. With climate change, it's like, oh, I'm one person. What can I possibly do? Well, there's actually a lot of things that you can do. There's a report I read recently by a group called Rare that took some of the suggestions from Project Drawdown, which has a big list of potential solutions to climate change technologies and things like that. How much would they save in greenhouse gases impact be? And Rare took the top 30 behavioral type interventions,
All right.
and calculated the range of possible engagement and ideal. And they said if you get large scale adoption of these behavioral changes, things that any one person can do, it was between 20% and 37% of all greenhouse gases could be reduced. Those are from behaviors that individual people can do. Some of them involve investing in a different type of car or something like that. But realizing that we do have power, and sometimes it's easier to put that power into action when you're thinking about someone else than necessarily yourself. When I was running a think tank and sort of getting a crash course in fundraising, one of the most important lessons I learned was don't think about it as asking money for you personally. Think about it as asking for all the people who you are going to help. And that sticks with me all the time. When I'm doing my own work, I'm thinking about all the people who have come back to me after workshops and said, hey, there were these 3 problems in my career that I didn't know what to do with, and now I've got actionable steps. So, I always think about the people who I am helping. So when people are thinking about, their own work and their own situation, keep in mind the greater problem that they're solving. The other thing that I found useful is being very systematic about reaching out to people who I haven't spoken to recently enough. I moved to Chicago from New York after 23 years in 2014. And that first year, it's like I hardly knew anyone. I had a job where I was working long hours. I was like writing my book on the weekends. But I very systematically made sure to talk to one of my old friends every day. And I kind of lost that habit as I found my tribe in Chicago. And the past couple weeks, I have to tell you, I've been in touch with people I've cared about in different parts of my life, but who usually fall out of the habit of talking to. And that's been one of the silver linings of this. So the more people can focus on the sort of human connections outside of the confines of their apartment or their daily life, I think the more liberal that that is. But really finding the source of your power, the human connections that support you, the contribution that you're making to the world, and also don't be afraid to ask for the help that you need.
Now, one of our actually listener, Katie, she just mentioned that Gray Rhino looks really interesting. Just purchased her book on Amazon. Looking forward to reading Michele's thoughts and finding more. There are a lot of people who are watching. They are saying thank you to you, and I think this is pretty amazing the way the world is moving. But at the same time, I think we need to hear from experts like you. I think, thank you very much, Michele, for your time and telling us what you think, and the policy expert you are. I think we need to think strategically, systematically, if we want to take care of this problem. And can you please talk a little bit about, before we leave, about your recent book that you're writing and some of the areas that you're touching, the risk assessment areas, and some of the other areas that you're looking, especially on the board mix, like, there's not many women on the board seats. Would love to know a little bit about that too.
Sure. Yeah. And before I forget, since I know there are more questions, would love to stay in touch. I'm on LinkedIn, Michele Wucker. I have a weekly column. I miss weeks every once in a while, but mostly weekly column on there that you can subscribe to. I'm on Twitter at Wucker, Wucker. My website is thegrayrhino.com with an A, but the E will also get you there, but it's just forwards. And actually in the LinkedIn column, which also goes up on my website, I have some guest columns there too, with people working on related things. I have about once a month. But I'm using those as a way to kind of work out some of the issues that I'm dealing with for the new book, as well as sharing useful insights for the Times from the Gray Rhino. But the new book is really about how each one of us comes to our decisions about risk. And it's very psychological. My first career aspiration was actually to be a psychiatrist. And then the medical school thing was just not going to work out because I pass out when I see blood, and that was just like not, it's just not a winner as a career choice. Obvious things we ignore. But looking at this interaction between culture, the systems around us, our governments, our local and national support systems, the way we were raised, the attitudes of the people all around us, our experiences, and then our own sort of, innate psychological tendencies, and then the habits and actions that we can take to affect our risk decision making, which has just led to some fascinating stuff. And I'm very, very excited about it. It started when I was spending a lot of time in China, because the book is a huge bestseller in China, hundreds of thousands of copies. I need an entourage when I go there, and they just instinctively got what I was talking about. Whereas I've initially gotten a lot of resistance in the U.S. I think people haven't wanted to accept that there are obvious things that we're not dealing with.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
in the finance industry,
One
in finance, so many.
One point I want to say that I just saw the Twitter from Scott Gottlieb. He said that I'm worried about emerging situations in New Orleans, Dallas, Atlanta, Miami, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, among others. In China, no province outside Hubei ever had more than 1,500 cases. In US, 11 states already hit that total. Our epidemic is likely to be national in scope.
Yeah, and it's that difference in response actually really strikes me. I mean, in the U.S., the sort of tendency is to say, "Oh, well, just like we're not going to deal with it till it's a complete crisis, and then we'll say it's a black swan that nobody saw coming."
Yeah.
Whereas in China, the central bank, the government, everyone is asking about gray rhinos all the time, and of course, the government has the leeway to act much more aggressively than the U.S. government. But there's also a sense of solidarity I've spoken with my friends in China, and there's really a sense of pride at how Chinese people kind of hunkered down and got through this, where I keep seeing on my news feed, and it drives me bonkers. You know, this kid was arrested for like coughing on police officers. Some woman at a grocery store coughed over all the produce. They had to throw out all this good produce and have
Wow.
things washed off. Here in Chicago, I'm actually really furious because I live right by the lake, and these sort of daily walks with my dog have been sanity. And it was really nice a few days ago, and a bunch of idiots went out, crowded the lakefront, were playing contact sports, not social distancing, and so the mayor shut the whole lakefront, even though in my neighborhood we haven't had any problem with social distancing as at all. So there's this real sense of me, and not looking out for others that I see so much more in the United States than I have in Asia, and I think it's a real problem. And that sense of yourself and the community around you actually affects the risks that you're willing to take, the good risks and the bad risks. There's some very, very interesting group dynamics that I'll go into more in the new book. Um, but it's hard. I mean, I'm very worried for this country. The amount of denial, the real nonchalance about the situation, and almost this, you know, aggressive denial of it, which is a defense mechanism, but not a very useful defense mechanism. So I'm very, very worried about that. And you know, you see Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. You look at some of the things that they have done to address this much more proactively. And I think we're going to have to take a very, very hard look at our culture in the United States, because this me-ism is self-destructive.
Right, right. And I think, yeah, I mean, I'm totally worried about what's going on and how things will shape in the near future. I wish I can continue talking to you like for another hour, because this was so insightful. This was something that we needed. We wanted to hear from the experts. And I think we are so overwhelmed with so much of misinformation around us, and people are just looking at every direction. But thank you, Michele, for your time. And thank you for your book. And we are looking forward to your next book that's going to come very soon. And this video I have recorded, though the recording did not start for the first few minutes. So, but you can again get her first question. I have asked it again. And I will be sharing this recording with everybody on social media. A lot of people have just said that they could not join live. They will be watching this video recorded on social media. Thank you, Michele, for your time. And I would love to do this again with you sometime whenever you have chances.
Thank you for organizing it. And when the new book comes out, you'll be the first to know. And hopefully we can do something, and we'll actually be allowed to meet in person by then.
Yes, I hope so. By that time, I hope this crisis die down and we can see much more solidarity, and we can bring much more people together, and we can see the brighter side of this. Thank you, Michele, for your time.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.